Well, folks, one thing this roundtable has always prided itself on is the type of speakers we get. And we've had some terrific speakers over the years. In fact, fellas like Bud Robertson became such a fixture for this roundtable. Well, he was in here every year in and year out. And it's something we pride ourselves on at this roundtable, and we should. Well, tonight we're going to extend that one more, and that's with the speaker we got. And she's going to come up here and talk about a most interesting subject that I'll very briefly mention. But she is representative of the growing number of really capable, competent women who are Civil War historians. She may be the leader of this group of historians that we have in this country. We're going to be blessed with yet another woman next month who's going to talk about the women in Cassius Clay's life. Now that ought to be kind of interesting. The guys would have a real interest in that. And it's Donna Terrell, who's here tonight. But we're going to leave Cassius Marcellus Clay for just a moment here and go to the Civil War itself. And our speaker tonight is Carolyn Janney. Carolyn Janney is the John L. Nau Professor of American Civil War History at the University of Virginia. She is the director of the John L. Nau Center for the study of the Civil War, also at the University of Virginia, and she is a graduate of the University of Virginia. She lectures all across the country and is becoming very well known for her lecturing. And I know we'll be, after tonight is over, you'll feel like we were so privileged to hear from Carolyn Janney. She's appeared in numerous television programs on history, American history, mostly Civil War history, and on the History Channel, where, my wife and I watched the film on Grant and Lincoln, and we're most impressed with your performance in that film. And she's published 8 books, and one, Remembering the Civil War, the other, Reunion, and its limits of Reconstruction. And then another book that we're going to hear from tonight, and that's a book entitled Ends of War, The Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox. And I'm sure many of you have wondered, any of you who read Civil War history, either deep in it or not, I wondered what it was like for those who surrendered at Appomattox. What happened to them after that? And remember, this country did not reunify for years after the war. So what happened to those folks? Well, folks, we are privileged and proud to introduce to you Carolyn Janney, who will tell us that story. Carolyn, come on.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful welcome that I've had. And now my clicker is missing. Oh no. I found it. I got it. Yep. Okay. Thank you, Kent, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming out on St. Patty's Day, nonetheless, when you could all be at Patty McDougal's or some other type of Irish bar tonight. But as we approach the 160th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, or Appomattox, I think it's a great time for us to think about what precisely that means. And I know for myself, and perhaps for many of you, I often use the term Appomattox as the end of the war. It's a term that seems to sum up. We all know what we're talking about when we talk about Appomattox. But what unfolded in that village and has been described time after time as the great closing act of the Civil War, I hope to convince you tonight was perhaps not the final act, and perhaps a prelude for other things to come. Because the surrender of Lee's army at Appomattox had been just that, the surrender of a single army. It was not a blueprint for what to do with the tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers. It was not a clear ending to the war. It was certainly not a peace treaty that dealt with political questions. Indeed, in the days, the weeks, and the months that followed April 9th, 1865, many of the unanticipated results of disbanding Confederate forces became issues not just for the United States government, but for local communities as well, for Black and white, North and South, loyal and rebel. In order to understand what this story looks like, we need to start in a familiar place. We'll start with McLean's parlor and the surrender terms that Grant offered Lee on that April 9th day. The first of the terms was standard in any surrender. That is, the Confederates would turn over their arms and their flags. But as at Vicksburg, Grant allowed the Confederates to go home on parole. And I've found that this is a point that we often gloss over, that the notion of parole is lost on us. These were prisoners of war. These were still classified. I want you to keep that in mind. They're prisoners of war that aren't being sent to POW camps. Rather, they are going home as paroled soldiers. But Grant added a provision that day that had not appeared in other surrenders, and one that would prove controversial from the moment that it was offered. And that is, paroled Confederates were not to be disturbed by United States authorities so long as they maintained good behavior. In other words, so long as they obeyed the law. By including this provision, Grant had tacitly acknowledged Lee's soldiers as enemy combatants who could not be tried as traitors for waging war. Like many issues that would unfold in the days and weeks to come, this is one that's going to be tested, would prove to be problematic. And I'll pause here and say that I found that many people conflate parole with pardon or parole with amnesty. That is absolutely not what happened at Appomattox. These are paroled prisoners of war to be sent home. Okay, so what happens after these two men agree upon these terms? They will both appoint commissioners, 3 from each side, who will hammer out the details. It'll be these 3 commissioners that will be charged with coming up with exactly what the process is going to look like. We'll also include what the surrender ceremony is going to look like. There will be a formal surrender ceremony at Appomattox of the infantry on April 12th, 1865. This had not been the case at Fort Donelson. This had not been the case at Vicksburg at the other 2 surrenders that Grant had overseen. But because this was Lee's army, because this was the most important Confederate army, the symbol of the Confederate nation, certainly by April of 1865, he did demand a formal surrender ceremony, and the commissioners would be charged with overseeing what this would look like. The other thing that they were charged with is coming up with what the how the names would be recorded. And for any of you who have ever done work in the compiled service record and you've come across a slip like this, what you're finding in this compiled service record comes from a list. There were 2 lists generated by the officers on each side, by regimental and division officers, that were charged with listing all of the men present at Appomattox who had in fact surrendered. And so then you will find this in their CSR. This is all good and well, but the evening of April 9th, Lee begins to worry. He knows that his men are paroled prisoners of war, but he wonders if there's actually proof that they are such. How does he have proof that they're not deserters? And so the next morning, the morning of April 10th, he meets with Grant for a final time. And there he asks Grant to come up with some sort of proof that in fact his men have surrendered themselves. And what is agreed upon are the passes that you might be familiar with. General Gibbon would have a printing press with him, and so they're going to come up with these passes on the fly that will be printed off en masse. Really interesting thing to keep in mind in terms of the logistics of how all of this works. It will be the Confederates themselves who fill out each of these passes. It's not Union officers who are overseeing this. These are distributed to the officers. They will give them out as they see fit. You'll find many different versions of the, you can see on the left-hand side, the different fleur-de-lis and the other adornments. There are 3 different ones that were printed at Appomattox. But the other thing that you might find, how many people in here have ever come across one of these parole passes? Oh, just a handful. These are incredibly valuable items if you come across them. But if you come across one like this, it's even more valuable because what you see before you are the stamps from provost marshal's offices, which leads to a second thing that Grant agreed to on the morning of April 10th. He agreed that Lee's men would be provided provisions and transportation to find their quickest and most direct route home if they had a parole pass from Appomattox. So they could go to the nearest provost marshal's office, or they could go to a place like City Point, and they could catch a steamer, use Union resources, use United States resources to get home as quickly as possible. And many of Lee's men will do this. They will take up Grant's offer to travel free aboard U.S. steamers upon railroads. Grant is going to reverse this policy within a few days, but this is the initial policy which is intended to get men quickly home, to get them home as quickly as possible. Some of those from Virginia will strike out immediately. Some make it home in a matter of days, 2 days, a week. Others, the trip will take much longer. The passes that you see before you are from members of Hood's Brigade that need to make it all the way back to Texas. And so that trip, as you might imagine, would take weeks. Some of Lee's soldiers don't make it home until July of 1865. Happy to talk about the logistics of that in the Q&A if you're interested. But one of the curious things that I noticed when I started doing research for this project, and one of the things that both Grant and his provost marshal noticed right away, is that a substantial number of Lee's men were not at Appomattox. Here we're going to do some very rough math. Of the 60,000 men available to the Army of Northern Virginia after the evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond on April 2nd, only some 26 to 28,000 of them were formally paroled between April 9th and April 12th at Appomattox. If we account for the approximately 11,530 casualties sustained between April 2nd and April 8th, a very conservative estimate would suggest that we're missing 20,000 soldiers. 20,000 soldiers who should have surrendered with Lee, but did not. Why didn't they? Well, their reasons were as varied as the men themselves. Many had been footsore and starving stragglers, unable to keep up with the relentless pace of Lee's army as it pressed ever west, looking for that railroad connection that would take them south toward North Carolina, toward Joseph E. Johnston's army. Some, however, believed that there was little use in trying so hard. There was little use in resisting any further, and they decided to go home. Others had learned that, in fact, a surrender was in the works, and they refused to forego the humiliation of surrendering. At least some slipped from the lines on April 9th, refusing to acquiesce or be conquered. More than 2,000 cavalry and artillerists had escaped from the Union cordon on April 9th, making their way toward Lynchburg. Many following the lead of cavalry officers such as Major General Thomas Rosser and Colonel Thomas Munford headed west toward Lynchburg, where they hoped to regroup and renew the fight. Some men disbanded, went home, awaiting word to fight again. And indeed, on April 12th, the very day of the surrender ceremony of Lee's infantry, that very day, Rosser rode to Staunton, Virginia, and I didn't include this on our map, but we can, just to the west of Lynchburg, if you keep going west over the mountains, you will come to Staunton, Virginia. From there, on April 12th, Staunton issued a proclamation from what he declared the headquarters of the Army of Northern Virginia. I'm going to pause here for a second and spell this out very explicitly. So he, on the day that the Army of Northern Virginia is surrendering, he is issuing a proclamation from the headquarters of the Army of Northern Virginia. And if that's not enough, he's going to give himself a nice promotion. He's going to promote himself to lieutenant general. And he called upon his men to shoulder their muskets once more. I'm going to read to you from his proclamation. To shoulder their muskets once more and, quote, return to the field to meet the arrogant invader who had insulted you, robbed you, murdered your dearest friends and relatives, outraged your fair women, despoiled your homes, and dishonored all that is most dear and sacred. He promised he would lead his men against this dastardly foe and would never surrender until, quote, the purple current ceases to flow from my heart, or until you are a free, independent, and happy people. Rise like men and come to me, he commanded. He instructed companies and regiments to assemble in places like Charlottesville, Staunton, or Lynchburg, Virginia, without delay. For men like Rosser, as well as Thomas Munford, Lunford Lomax, and others, the war was not yet over. Lee might have surrendered, but their war was not over. Some of these men decided to head south toward North Carolina, where they hoped to join up the forces of Joseph E. Johnston to offer themselves and to fight once more. Appomattox thus represents a great irony. It was and continues to be seen as the end of Lee's army, and by extension, the end of the Civil War. But more than 20,000 men didn't surrender. So was Lee's army really gone? Did it no longer exist? And what of those 20,000 men? Did Grant's terms apply to them? Well, Grant certainly thought so. On the morning of April 10th, after his final conversation with Lee, he received a telegram from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And Stanton asked Grant if the troops operating in northern and eastern Virginia were to be included in the surrender or, quote, only those under Lee's immediate personal command. In particular, I think Stanton is asking about Mosby. I've had a conversation with some of you already. I'm writing a biography of Mosby right now, and I'm even more convinced this is what Stanton is talking about. Anyway, Grant writes back to Stanton, and he says, the original terms, I did not include all of those. Did not include any groups that were separate from the main body of the Army of Northern Virginia. But after thinking about it, in fact, they should be included. They should all be included except Mosby. Mosby gets a big circle around him. His men are included, but Mosby's not included. All of this is evidence that Grant wants the war to end as quickly and swiftly as possible. He knows that paroling soldiers is a deterrent. It will keep them from continuing to fight the war. He trusted paroled soldiers more so than he did the notion of guerrillas who would take to the mountains and to the hollows of Virginia. He said, this is what we need to do. We need to set up paroling stations wherever these men might be. Grant was incredibly fearful of guerrilla-style warfare, keeping in mind that he began the war in Missouri and in the West, and thinking about his experiences there. Sherman is worried about this as well. Sherman is writing from North Carolina. He's writing Grant saying, hey, we need to be careful that we, in fact, get these men to surrender as armies. because we could have a guerrilla war on our hand if we don't. Anyway, so this is the impetus for what becomes the process of paroling members of Lee's command at places far flung from Appomattox. This is one of the things that I ended up going down a rabbit hole when I started off on this project. I thought I was going to write an article-length chapter that would talk about how Lee's men went home and what that process looked like. And then I got to the National Archives and I kept finding box after box after box labeled with places like Burkeville or Black and White, Virginia, or Winchester, Virginia. And I started noticing that these men are getting paroled at places. Again, one of the first places that they get paroled is at Burkeville, which is the red circle to the right. It says Junction. It's to the east of Appomattox. You can see Appomattox misspelled in this map. This is the first working railroad junction. If you're traveling on foot east from Appomattox, the first place that you're going to find a working train at this point is Burkeville Junction. The provost marshal recorded the names of 1,614 Confederates only 2 days after the surrender at Appomattox. In a 3-day stretch that followed, more would come flooding in. But it's in Winchester, Virginia, up in the valley, that Major General Winfield Scott Hancock also ordered circulars posted. Stanton had told him to do so, announcing that any members of Lee's command who might be making their way home, or perhaps they had been members of those cavalry commands that had disbanded, if they would come in, they too could be paroled under the very same terms that Grant had offered Lee at Appomattox. He reproduces the entire exchange of letters. Some of you are probably familiar with the exchange of letters that goes back and forth between Grant and Lee in the days leading up to April 9th. And Hancock has this published in the local newspaper. He also has it printed, as you see on circulars like this, and posted throughout the lower Shenandoah Valley, trying to convince people that, yes, in fact, Lee has surrendered. And he also publishes a message. He publishes a letter in the local newspapers urging Confederates to turn themselves in. He says, every military restraint shall be removed that is not absolutely essential. And he promised, and here you can hear him talking to mothers and wives. He promised your sons, your husbands, and your brothers shall remain with you unmolested if they would turn themselves in. Again, more to this story later, but Mosby is still excluded at this point. Here we have an example of what these, the list of names of men who are paroled at Winchester, they come pouring in. Their names are recorded. And their parole pass, you might notice, looks different than the parole pass that's issued at Appomattox. This is because by this point, they now have the same types of passes that if you were released from a prison like Point Lookout, you would receive this type of pass. What's really interesting about this pass, though, is it includes physical descriptions. Wonderful for those of us doing research. We want to know what a soldier looked like. But really practical if you are a Union provost marshal and you are trying to ascertain who an individual soldier is. If you have his height, his hair color, his eye color. Soldiers start pouring in to Winchester, but they flood into the former capital, into Richmond, Virginia. Almost 2,000 a day are coming into Richmond, Virginia. This is a picture. I'm not sure if any of you know Waite Rawls, but he was at what was formerly the Museum of the Confederacy, then became the American Civil War Museum. And I was talking about this, and he pointed out this image, which is the former White House of the Confederacy. And just to the right, I'm not sure my pointer will show over there, there's a group of men that are standing in line. And Waite surmises that this was in fact near a Union provost marshal office, and that many of these Confederates perhaps are those who have showed up. This is taken days after Appomattox. Perhaps are those who are showing up to in fact turn themselves in and be paroled. Some of them might included, or in that picture, we might have included a man like Private Spencer Waring of the 9th Virginia Cavalry. You can see from his CSR that he's paroled on April 25th. Again, any of you that might have done research in the CSRs and you've come across these dates that are after Appomattox, it's because thousands upon thousands of Lee's men turned themselves into provost marshal's offices in the days, weeks, again, even months after Appomattox. This is a map that's reproduced in a slightly different form in the book, but showing all of the places and the density of where these men are turning themselves in. You can see many, many, many turning themselves in Richmond, and those numbers are only for a few days. Those numbers in Richmond aren't quite accurate that you see there, but Richmond, of course, another place. All of this reflecting several things, one of which is that Appomattox was not the end of the road for many of Lee's men, but it also shows the flexibility of Grant's terms, the ways in which he was willing to work with to try to end the war as quickly as possible, and trying to be as inclusive and as magnanimous as possible. But it's not just magnanimity that motivates him. He truly knows that he has to nip this in the bud. He's got to end it as quickly as possible. But Grant had not and could not have accounted for a host of social, political, and legal questions that followed the surrender and the disbanding of the Confederate Army. And for the rest of the time, I'd like to discuss two of those questions with you. The first of those questions: would Confederate soldiers, paroled or not, be allowed to pass through loyal Union territory on their way home? Why is this even a question? Aren't most of these men from the Confederate States? Shouldn't they be heading in that direction? Well, within a week of Lee's surrender at Appomattox, large numbers of paroled prisoners were streaming into Washington, D.C., into Baltimore, and as this image shows, into New York City. Many of them requesting free transportation to their homes here in Kentucky, in Tennessee, and other southern states. General Lew Wallace, and we'll come back to Lew Wallace in a few minutes, he's in Baltimore at this point, and he is absolutely beyond exasperated with the number of Confederates that are steaming into Baltimore Harbor every day, especially in the wake of Lincoln's assassination. And he writes to Grant, and he complains about the fact that all of these paroled Confederates are rolling into Baltimore every day. And Grant responds, offering his own seemingly changing interpretation of the paroles. This is Grant. It was no part of the agreement that we were to transport or feed paroled prisoners. By the terms of the surrender, they were allowed to return to their homes, and I ordered that their paroles should be a pass to go through our lines where it was necessary to do so to reach their homes, and that when they traveled on roads or boats run exclusively by the government, no fare would be collected. I did not calculate that men from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia would expect to go home by way of New York. Why should he have? Well, some of these Confederate soldiers said, we are on our direct way home. There are numerous soldiers that are detained at Fortress Monroe, Hampton Roads, Virginia. They've made their way there. They think they're going to catch steamers, and their plan is to take that steamer. I wish I were closer to one of these. Maybe this will work. Okay, can you see my little arrow here? Here's Fortress Monroe. What they want to do is sail up the Chesapeake Bay, go to Baltimore, jump on the B&O, head over towards Cincinnati, down to Louisville, and down into Kentucky and Tennessee. In fact, for many of these men, this was the quickest route home. Doesn't make it any better for Lew Wallace or for Grant. They're not just detained at Fort Monroe. They're also detained in places like New Orleans and Galveston, and within Union lines. If we think about Grant's language, he talks about within Union lines, and that means in places like Norfolk, Virginia. If you are from Norfolk and you need to pass through Union lines to get home, that's one thing. If you're from Alexandria, Virginia, and you need to pass through Union lines to get home, that's one thing. But when men get to places like Alexandria, this is a sketch of a paroled soldier from Lee's army coming into Alexandria, being detained and being questioned by the provost marshal, asking where he had been, whose unit he had fought in. And from there, his name would be printed in the newspaper. Alexandria had been under Union control from very early in the war. And if you look at any of the pages of the Alexandria Gazette in the days and weeks after Appomattox, you will see a list just like this, warning all loyal residents of the rebels in their midst, of the paroled soldiers in their midst. But that was not enough. Some of these men, including Tom Murray, whose name appears on this list, found themselves not just brought before the provost marshal, and not just with their names included on such a list, but detained in this place. Price, Birch and Company, which had been a wholesaler, a dealer in enslaved people. Thomas Murray had been with the 12th Virginia. He makes it all the way back to Fairfax County, where he is detained, and he gets taken to a dark room. He's not sure exactly where he is when his eyes begin to adjust to the darkness. He sees other members of his regiment, and he looks around and realizes that he's been held, along with fellow Confederates, in a slave pen. Could this be any more ironic? Men who had gone to war in order to protect the rights of slaveholders, now held in the very pens from which they had bought and sold other men and women. In fact, Thomas Murray's father had owned 7 slaves in 1860, some of whom had been bought from this very same place. All of this is a reminder that these men are paroled prisoners of war. They were not free men. It was unclear what the future would bring. Would the states be, would they re-enter the Union? And if so, what would be the status of Confederate soldiers? I know we talk about that parole at Appomattox. We talk about what Grant and Lee negotiated. But that wasn't clear that was in fact a pardon. It wasn't a pardon. And this is all on the table in the late spring and early summer of 1865. Second question that Grant had not contended with. What was to be done with the approximately 70,000 men from the loyal states of Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland who fought for the Confederacy? I'm sure you all well know that around 25,000 Kentuckians fought for the Confederacy. It was one thing to send paroled soldiers back to states that had seceded. There, the majority of the population had been in rebellion, and the terms for recognizing civil governments were still up for debate. For example, would Lincoln's 10% plan still be in effect? But what about Confederates from states that had never left the Union, where the majority of the population was deemed loyal? Would Confederate soldiers be allowed to return and live in those states? This is not something that people took for granted in the spring and summer of 1865, especially in the wake of Lincoln's assassination. Booth and many other conspirators had been from Maryland, and so this really calls into question what should be done with Confederates from those states. Indeed, as early as April 12th, so before the assassination, Union officers worried about the effect of returning Confederates, that the effect returning Confederates were having upon Baltimore. Some 20,000 Marylanders had served in the Confederate armies, and now many of those are those men that are sailing in to Baltimore Harbor each day. Only days after the surrender, one Union officer had asked Grant whether all soldiers paroled by Lee's terms might be required to report to the provost marshal upon entering the city, register their names, and discard their Confederate uniforms. But Lincoln's assassination on April 14th by city native John Wilkes Booth only heightened the problem in Baltimore. The city was immediately placed under martial law. All Confederates in the city were, in fact, ordered to the provost marshal, where their papers were to be examined, so their parole passes. Only those who could prove that their former residence lay within the city limits would be allowed to remain. And they would be forced to abandon their, according to the Union officer, treasonous Confederate uniforms within 12 hours of arriving in the city. In the following weeks, both Grant and Attorney General James Speed would weigh in on this. They would offer opinions and policies that modified the original surrender terms as given at Appomattox. It's really imperative for us to keep in mind context here. Johnston's army is still in the field. Kirby Smith's is still in the field. On April 19th, which is the day of Lincoln's funeral in Washington, Grant informed his subordinates, quote, "All who claim homes in states that never passed ordinances of secession have forfeited them and can only return on compliance with the amnesty proclamation," i.e. taking the oath. He spelled out which states. Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri are such states. They may return to West Virginia on their paroles. We'll come back to that. Well, again, I'm getting ahead of myself with my slides. So the orange states here, you all probably well know, are the loyal states, loyal slaveholding states that stay in the Union. But here's our man, Attorney General James Speed. On April 22nd, he's going to respond to an inquiry by Secretary of War Stanton. Stanton, like Lew Wallace, had been incensed at the number of former Confederates that were coming into, for Stanton's point of view, coming into Washington, D.C., and he was loath to see them walking around the streets of Washington in their Confederate uniform as if they had not been waging a war against the United States. And so he writes to Attorney General Speed, asking Speed to offer a legal opinion on Grant's terms as written for Appomattox. And this is what Speed has to say. He says, "Rebel officers and soldiers who appear in public in their uniform are violating their parole and therefore can be arrested and detained." Now, keep in mind, the surrender terms of Appomattox don't say anything about discarding one's uniform. So this is something new that's been added to the table. Like Grant, Speed declared that the rebels, quote, "had no homes in loyal states. They could not return to," and again, he lists them, "Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky without taking an oath of allegiance." Well, in Baltimore, General Wallace wastes no time implementing these orders. He orders the arrest and imprisonment of any Marylander who had served in the Confederate armies and had already returned home. He issued a circular appealing for information from, quote, "loyal citizens" and ferreting out such offenders. So he's asking neighbors to report on neighbors if they know of Confederates who have returned to Maryland. But this isn't just a problem playing out among the Union High Command or in the executive. On April 24th, the Baltimore City Council formally protested the return of any Confederates. Quote, "Believing as we do, their presence in our midst will be a constant source of irritation, fraught with the deadliest mischief." You can hear references to Lincoln's assassination there. A group of Unionists in Frederick, Maryland, and Carroll County barred Confederates from returning. Those in Allegheny County created a Committee of Vigilance and Safety. All of the counties that you see here in the diagonal lines are counties where these committees of vigilance were established. You can hear the Revolutionary War rhetoric, looking out for those enemies within your midst. And they were charged with reporting on any former Confederate who might return to these counties. It's not just that. We have congressmen who are getting involved. Benjamin Harris, who is a citizen of Maryland and a Democratic member of Congress, was arrested on April 26th for giving money to 2 paroled Army of Northern Virginia soldiers so that they might disregard their paroles and continue to, quote, "make war against the United States." And in early May, in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, Henry Kidd Douglas was arrested and tried by a military commission for wearing his Confederate uniform. He was trying to get to his father's home, which was just across the river in Maryland. He had gone to get his photograph taken with a young lady, comes out into the streets wearing his Confederate uniform, and he is immediately arrested hauled to Washington, D.C., where he was detained and forced to participate in the military commission of the Lincoln conspirators. He would be held at Fort Delaware until August 23rd. We know that now, but you can imagine what he's thinking in July of 1865 about whether he's ever going to be released. But this brings us to the topic of West Virginia. Indeed, Unionists in West Virginia were aghast that both Grant and Speed had exempted Confederates from returning to West Virginia. That is, they could return to West Virginia. While West Virginia Unionists were equally as desirous of any acts of rebellion, like the assassination, as Marylanders, there was another concern driving the reaction of West Virginians. Although West Virginia had been admitted as a state in 1863, there still remained a great deal of fear that the state would be reintegrated into Virginia, that there would be a legal dispute, and in fact, it would revert to Virginia. If rebels returned and voted, they said, they would potentially outnumber Unionists. There were at least 8,000 men from West Virginia who fought in the Confederate armies. Unionists thus faced the prospect of having thousands of paroled Confederates returning to a state that they were trying to destroy. Same thing happens in West Virginia as we see happening in Maryland. That is, counties will form these vigilance committees, and these are only the ones that I've been able to find. I'm sure that there are more that were out there. And it's more than just forming a committee. In Marion County, for example, when reports of 2 returned Confederates reached the Home Guard, they visited the men's mother and insisted that the men had not returned. The Home Guard hears rustling up behind the house in the woods. They go to check it out. They find the 2 brothers hiding in the woods. A gunfight ensues, and one of the men is killed. All of this to say that the violence, that the killing, that the dying for Lee's army continued well after Appomattox. Well, ending the war would mean a host of new realities for the entire nation, but perhaps for none more so than African Americans, especially the 4 million who'd been enslaved at the war's onset. Indeed, in 1861, nearly 1 out of every 20 to 30 Confederates brought a slave with him to manage gear, to cook meals, to mend and wash clothing, to tend the horses. And the number and percentage of body servants declined over the course of the war, even as the Confederate government impressed more slaves into labor, which means that at Appomattox, there were hundreds of Black men who were still with the Army of Northern Virginia. Some we know about because they were listed on the paroles. We know about others, however, because Confederates wrote home about them. For example, John Crawford Anderson of the 13th South Carolina informed his father that his valet and cook Peter, quote, still proves true and says he will never desert the cause, but is very much elated at the idea of going home. Here we can hear the foreshadowing of the faithful slave notion from the Lost Cause. We don't have any records of Peter's emotion, but perhaps he too worried about what it meant to return home. He might have been like William H. Harrison, who was in fact in the Union Army at this time, who was camping opposite of Lee's army. Harrison had been born in Richmond and accompanied his owner to war with Lee's army as a body servant until he had been captured in 1863 and forced to fight with the Union Army. Yet from the Union ranks near the Appomattox Creek, he could proudly claim his part in destroying slavery. I was with General Grant when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, he wrote. That was freedom. But for the Black men who continued to be with Lee's army, there was a choice to make. Choice to make of whether or not they would travel home alongside their former masters or whether they would strike out on their own. And for many of them, the safer bet was in fact to travel with their former masters. And they did so in part because of fear. There were at least a handful of Confederate soldiers, including a group from Florida, who bragged about killing not one, not two, but 3 United States colored troops on their way home. They were infuriated by having to have their buttons snipped by USCT soldiers. Members of Hood's brigade were furious that they had to disembark off a train because United States colored troop soldiers got preference in riding on the train. Nothing represented the world turned upside down more than the presence of Black soldiers, of Black men in uniform. There is so much more to this story, but I'd like to leave you with this. Rather than serving as a clear ending to the war, the surrender of Lee's army brought into stark relief many of the legal, the social, and the political questions that had plagued the war from the very beginning. Perhaps most important, there had never been a golden moment when Lee's soldiers had been so thoroughly subjugated they were willing to accept any conditions. If anything, the humiliation of registering at a provost marshal's office, the perils faced by border region Confederates, their struggles to return home, and the presence of both white and Black Union occupying troops emboldened their claims to Southern righteousness and Northern barbarity. The disbanding of Lee's army had not marked the end of the nation's division. Indeed, in many ways, it was only the beginning, foreshadowing much of what would play out not only in the weeks and months to come, but indeed in the decades to come. Thank you.